Greetings! In this tutorial, we will look at Zend Expressive, a new way to create applications from Zend framework. We'll use the supplied command to create our new Expressive project. I moved the old MVC tutorial into its own subfolder. The last parameter of the command is the name of the application we want to create. I'll stick with Expressive. Hit downloading dependencies to create a project. First question, flat is good enough. We'll pick Zend Service Manager for dependency injection. For routing question, Zend Router best fits for MVC style frameworks. We'll pick the recommended fast route for Expressive. For template rendering, we will stick with Zend View. Whoops for error handler is good. And wait for it to finish downloading dependencies. It's done. Verify that we are in development mode enabled state. Open the target folder and open the editor init. Ensure composer configurations have been properly detected. This is our composer JSON. To run the application, we can use in a composer the serve script, or we can choose to do it manually, but if we do so, we have to do it from the perspective of the public folder. I tend to use the public folder. That's running, and now we should be able to open it in the browser. And here it is. Let's run all the tests. And they work too. How did we get here? In the editor, let's go to src, app, handler, homepage handler, and put a breakpoint in a handle function to see how does it arrive at this point. We refresh the page, get here. It's not very obvious how we got here. The stack is a little bit cryptic, but we do see a lot of the words middleware as we go down. If we look closer, we get some interesting names such as route, route result, dispatch middleware, URL helper middleware, and an error handler. This suggests that there is some kind of system that takes in URLs from the browser and passes them on to something that figures out what route that URL belongs to, and then somehow knows to arrive at this homepage handler. Another observation we can make is the sequence of these calls. And notice how they go from one to another, starting from the application handler, request handler, all the way step by step towards the main one. This sequential step-by-step pass one result of the task to the other for further processing is the key moment to realize what middleware in Expressive is. If I was to guess, there is probably a configuration file somewhere that dictates how these middleware handlers are aligned, how they pass data from each other. Sure enough, there is a config pipeline PHP file that begins with the error handler, server URL middleware, route, as we go down, URL helper, dispatcher, and that should be recognizable with what we have seen in the stack trace. Then we just have to know that routes PHP does a translation of the URL from the browser towards the actual class handlers. This is where we see the registration of the route to the homepage handler where the breakpoint is. And we also have another API ping that goes to ping handler and returns a JSON response. That is demoed at the ping test link that does indeed return only JSON, no HTML, unlike this one did. Hopefully, you are beginning to get an image of a system that takes in a request from the browser, processes it step by step, all the way until the last component in a chain that returns a response to the browser for display. But if that was really the case, Why do we have an error handler as the very first step in a process? Do we already have errors so early in the system? Well, we don't see any. The page loads just fine. So why are we handling errors immediately as soon as we enter into this pipeline? To answer that question, let's look at an abstract architecture overview of Zend Expressive. Middleware is like a step at a conveyor belt, where a conveyor belt is the whole expressive, and a middleware is a particular stop on a conveyor belt that is designated to do its own very specific task, such as creating a session in memory. That task is very specific for that middleware, so a memory session creator would not be parsing URL parameters, for example. The analogy Expressive uses for this conveyor-like workflow is pipeline. You pour in some water in one end of the pipe, it passes through all the pipes, through all the filtering system or something, and it comes out as a desired product on the other end of the pipe. Unfortunately, this pipeline analogy does not work very well in Expressive when it comes to talking about sending responses back into the browser. Water doesn't really flow backwards in the pipes. In a video, I show how the output of the last component travels back through every middleware until the beginning entry point. This gives us a unique opportunity where not only can we pass the data onto the next component for processing, we can also see the result of the next step at where we currently are. Therefore, the first member of the pipeline automatically is a last member, as it's able to see not only what's coming in, but also the overall result of what happened throughout every chain in the workflow. So if the very first middleware also happens to be very last, and we can inspect all the subsequent middleware results at this point, why not take the opportunity to check if there has been any errors along the way the pipeline before we put the result back into the browser? This is why we see error handler as the first step in the pipeline. It receives the request from the browser, then passes it on to the rest of the pipeline components. Then as the output from those components comes back to it, it can inspect if there were any errors along the way. If there were no errors, it passes that output right back into the browser. And if there are any errors, it takes those errors into an error template to show what they are, and then returns 500 or 400 or whatever is needed. Now that is a lot of moving parts, lots of data passed around, lots of middleware talking to each other, and a bunch of this middleware can actually come from whole different systems, not just Expressive. How do they all communicate with each other without conflict? For that, there is PSR 7 and PSR 15 standards that are used for communication. PSR 7 dictates how the data structure that holds the information to be passed between the middlewares and from the browser should look like, so that every subsequent middleware does not have to worry about how the object was created and by whom. It's always consistent interface, so everybody always knows how to read that information to be processed. Object to be processed by next middleware must implement server request interface, while the output of each middleware to be potentially inspected by the previous steps must implement a response interface. In order to smoothly receive and send out these request and response interfaces, all middleware must implement PSR 15 standard request handler interface. These standards are described in detail at the PHP-Fig website, and the amazing part here is Expressive is just an implementation of those standards. So knowing these standards, learning them, isn't necessarily learning Expressive. You just know Expressive as a byproduct of understanding the standards. And once you learn them here, you can actually apply them in any other framework, Zend or not, that uses them. Before this, third-party modules had to be written specifically for Zend, and if they weren't, you had to port them to Zend framework compatibility yourself before you could use them. Now you can go to Packages, type in PSR 15, and any project that uses 15 with PSR 7 data transmission is going to work without any need to port it. All you have to do is include them in the pipeline sequence configuration. Why did we spend time on extra theory? Back in MVC days, the application mostly worked by convention. You just had to know what controller and action will be hit, and you just had to know by convention what template will be rendered from that action, and then all the events that go along with it. In Expressive, you will be doing a lot of that manually, so you have to understand how the architecture works. Since we are talking about templates, let's see how this HTML code here got generated by the homepage handler. This handler is that blue rectangle at the end of the Zend Expressive pipeline, the last component in the execution chain, therefore it must return a response interface. One of those responses is an HTML response. All HTML response really needs is just some string, and then this will travel from this endpoint all the way backwards through the pipeline, out through the error handler and into the browser. So this just has to be a basic string. Hello from last handler in chain. And here it is. Now we certainly do not want to mix HTML layout code with PHP logic code, so we have to use templates and accordingly a template renderer. Since we do not use naming conventions between the action names and the template names, we have to specify manually to the template renderer what we want to render at any given time. So here we're saying that we want template named homepage to be rendered with this array data. The homepage template is found under templates, app, which corresponds to this namespace before the two double columns, homepage PHTML. This should look familiar with our initial skeleton homepage that we opened. And this namespace and file names are configured under config provider, templates, get templates, path. So here we have app, that's the name before the double column, and that corresponds to the directory templates app over here. So now everything that comes after the double column is going to correspond to these file names. Variable placeholders in a template work as you would expect. There is this, the scope of the template, template name, which is one of the variables that gets passed into the data as a second parameter. Here we have the template name as the array key of the data that gets matched into the template placeholder. Expressive comes with provisioning for template renderers from other frameworks. Again, you're not forced to stick with everything Zend. I like Zend View, so I'm going to stick with it. We also know we're using fast route for this, not Zend router. And the page should be back to nice colorful. Very important to note at this point that regardless of what you want to return for your rendered string, it must implement an instance of response interface, and it must come out of the function called handle. This is described in the request handler interface. The class which inherits the request handler interface must be the last in the pipeline or route configuration. There can actually be more than one handlers for a particular route. Can be in a list of an array as long as the request handler interface is the last one. And we can write other middlewares and other handlers in the next tutorials. The next question that might arise is, what is this container name? How does the template even get into the instance of this homepage handler? We have already shown how Expressive is a collection of middleware arranged in a sequence, and that sequence is described in the pipeline or the routes files. Let's see the parameter types needed to configure one of these. First parameter is the string, the path to match. Second one is a callable to a function that will be executed for that match, a middleware interface or a request handler string. And the third one is just the name of the configuration, so we can reference it in other places. So notice that the second parameter is not an instance of a class, but only the name of it. And we also don't have the three parameters needed to instantiate the homepage handler anywhere in this configuration. All middleware and handlers are created using factory design pattern. They are also configured in the config provider class for that module under get dependencies. Here is the factory where we see our homepage handler and the factory that knows what the homepage handler needs for its happiness. We see how it collects the three parameters it needs for its construction and returns an instance of it. Looking at this, you may not immediately understand where some of the other dependencies coming from, like our template renderer, since we have not registered it in our config provider. To see other dependencies registered in our dependency container, which may come from other modules, other things that you have installed, we can go to config.php, and here we have a list of all the modules that have been registered into the Expressive framework. Not to be confused with the pipeline, but just the modules that need to be turned on and have their configuration file read to register the dependencies. Here we have Zend view as one of the dependencies we're looking for, and its config provider gives us the template renderer interface that we are importing into the homepage handler to draw our HTML. In the list of configurable modules, we also see the app config provider that we have been looking at that assembles our own module. And we have all of the modules, both ours and external provided by frameworks or other installations, assembled together under a config aggregator. This aggregator, combining all the configurations together, outputs it into one single array that gets included in container.php. Here we see it's doing a require of the file and passing it on to the service manager. A very interesting part of the aggregate configuration is this PHP file provider that distinguishes between local and global configurations. We will definitely come back here when we do our database connections. The PHP file provider with global versus local PHP file will know whether to include the global configurations that will be on the production server versus local configurations that are overriding the global ones. If you're confused why sometimes it is called Service Manager and other times it is called Container Interface, that's because this is also now a global standard called PSR11. PSR11 describes how dependency injections between PHP classes is done, and Service Manager happens to be one of the implementations for it. Now that we know what this is, we can get rid of the other ones. You can see all the alternatives to Service Manager, all the PSR11 implementations that we have. We'll keep just Service Manager. And now we can talk about how to get request parameters into our handlers. Server request interface is this black arrow that transmits data between the middleware and from the browser into the handler. The most frequent usage you will encounter is request get attribute that has been passed somehow from the previous middleware. For the simple example so far, we will add just a URL parameter, so some kind of variable. That way, when we go to here and we put in value for that parameter variable, we can pick it up with get attribute, And here we see it come through. If you want a query parameter, the ones that come after the question mark, query and the parameter, that comes from request function get query params. Here we have the array of all of them. We can keep it as an array, or we can access the individual ones directly. And here we have that. Again, this is a PSR standard, so this will work across any framework. On this note, I will end the basic overview of Expressive by committing the installation we have so far. Installing Expressive. And next time we will create some models and connect those models to the handler and maybe write some middleware.